If you are thinking about those big questions of life, especially that matter of origins, I believe this film is for you. The relationship between evolution and the Genesis story is and has been one of the most contentious issues in the past almost 200 years. However, the situation has turned out to be more complex. Firstly, because evolution means a number of different things, some of which are not at all contentious. And secondly, some strongly held aspects of evolutionary theory are now under serious question by biologists, so that the situation is very different to what it was years ago. In light of this and my other research, my position is that it is not tenable to believe that evolution has disproved Christianity. And I would love it if you could give me the next 40 minutes or so to explore that statement with you. There are multiple ways to deal with the tension that sometimes arises here between Genesis and evolutionary theory. Christian thinkers, some of whom are biologists, have come up with different ways of addressing this tension. It is certainly not necessary to have a comprehensive understanding of biology and Genesis to become a Christian. We will be speaking about issues over which Christians disagree. It is important to note up front that by concentrating attention on disagreements, we could easily lose our sense of proportion. It is, after all, worth reminding ourselves that the New Testament nowhere mentions the age of the earth or the days of Genesis, but it has a great deal to say about creation. It is my view that creation, as outlined in Genesis in the Bible, is a fact, and that fact, rather than its timing, is the determining issue in shaping the great narrative of history in which meaning can be found. And if you are thinking about those big questions of life, especially that matter of origins, I believe this film is for you. When thinking about such questions, it's important to listen to several points of view. Amongst all the various ideas proposed, I'm going to speak about the one that makes most sense to me, in the hope that it will help you to make up your own mind on the topic. And since we are considering the biblical perspective, it's important to start with what Genesis actually says, before moving on to differing opinions and coming to some tentative conclusions. Genesis 1 says that human beings are special. I quote, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." A Hebrew psalm says the heavens declare the glory of God. However, we never read anywhere in Scripture that the heavens bear the image of God. Only humans do. Moreover, in saying that God made human beings out of the dust of the ground, Genesis affirms that human life has a chemical base. But Genesis denies the reductionist addendum of the materialist that life is nothing but physics and chemistry. The yawning gulf between inorganic and organic matter is underlined in Genesis by the fact that on day 3, God speaks twice. This feature also characterizes day 6, where God also speaks more than once. The first time to say, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures," and the second, "Let us make man." That is, according to Genesis, you cross neither the gulf between non-life and life, nor the gulf between animals and human beings by unguided natural processes alone. Without God speaking, there is an unbridgeable discontinuity. Human life was not produced as a result of blind matter fumbling its unguided way through a myriad of different permutations. Thus, Genesis challenges head-on atheism's fundamental assertion that human life has appeared without the activity of God's mind, so that there is nothing special about human beings. I'm tempted to add that it looks as if the writer of Genesis foresaw the contemporary debate. The difference between animals and humans is further underscored by the fact that God assigned to humans the responsibility of stewardship over the animals. Finally, that difference is also the focus in Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 to 24, where the way in which the narrative is structured shows that the naming of the animals is to be read in the context of finding a helper for the first man, Adam. The lesson is that there was no helper found fit for or corresponding to Adam among the many animal species that were then around, and therefore including, be it noted, non-human hominids, for example, monkeys. It is interesting that the first lesson Adam was taught, according to the Bible, is that he was fundamentally different from all the other creatures. For the Christian, there is another consideration to bring to bear on the question of the uniqueness of human beings. The central claim of Christianity is, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, as it is written in John chapter 1, verse 14. That is, God coded himself into humanity. He became human. There is no question as to this being the central supernatural event in history, a direct action of God of unfathomable significance. The miracle of God becoming human, an event known as the Incarnation, surely makes it less difficult to believe that the human race itself began, indeed had to begin, with a supernatural intervention. Science cannot rule out that possibility either, despite attempts by thinkers, from David Hume to the new atheists, to say the contrary. What science can tell us about human beings, though, is what it can tell us about the universe, that they also had a beginning. What the Incarnation tells us is that human beings are unique. They are so created that God himself could become one. Some schools of thought hold that there was no death before Adam's initial wrongdoing in the Garden of Eden. It's known as sin. As we now come to the theological problem of death before Adam's wrongdoing, it is worth reminding ourselves not to confuse things that differ, namely the age of the universe, the age of the earth, the age of life, and the age of humanity. Clearly, the earth is younger than the universe, biological life is younger than the earth, and human life is younger than biological life. If life on earth existed long before the creation of human beings, then there must have been death before the entry of sin into the world, as other biological life would need to feed on something, thereby making other living things die. How can this be in the light of Paul's statement in Romans 5 in the New Testament? I quote, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." This is clearly a serious issue with profound implication for our understanding of salvation, since, as has often been pointed out, if Paul is wrong in his diagnosis of the origin of sin and death, how can we expect him to be right regarding its solution? So let's look carefully at exactly what Paul says and what he does not say. He says that death passed upon all human beings as a result of Adam's sin. He does not say that death passed upon all living things. In other words, what Scripture actually says is that human death is a consequence of sin. That makes sense. Humans are moral beings, and human death is the ultimate wages of moral transgression. We do not think of plants and animals in terms of moral categories. We do not accuse the lion of sinning when it kills an antelope or even a human being. Paul's deliberate and careful statement would appear to leave open the question of death before the fall at levels other than human. Indeed, since fruit and vegetables are explicitly mentioned as God-given diet in Genesis itself, plant life can scarcely be an issue here. Plant death cannot therefore have been a consequence of the first human sin, even though plant death is death. What about the animals? Whales, for instance, are mammals, and they do not live on green vegetation. Their food is living seafood, and so by eating, whales cause death. The same is true of many sea and land creatures. Had they some alternative source of food before Adam sinned? We see no evidence for this. In a similar way, the view that animal death did not exist before humans sinned makes the existence of predators problematic. For example, the woodpecker has astonishingly powerful muscles in its neck to enable it to peck out insects from trees. Some snakes secrete poisons, and some fish can launch bolts of electricity that stun their prey. If there was no death of any kind before the first human sin, and therefore no predation, did these exquisitely complex neck muscles, poison sacs, and electrical organs come into existence as a result of that sin? If that is so, would it not make that sin the trigger of a creation process, a feature that seems very unlikely and on which the Bible appears to be silent? Or did God foresee the change, build the mechanisms into the creatures in advance, and then do something to set them in operation? What then, it will be asked, does Paul mean by his later statement in his letter to the Romans, where he says, "For the creation was subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God." Paul speaks of decay and corruption. Think of what happens to flowers. Daffodils can get disease. However, daffodils, whether diseased or not, die down in the early summer. Only the bulbs are left, which then grow again the following year. Is that process of dying down the same thing as disease? Surely not. It's part of what we call the cycle of nature. Is this a good thing? Part of the original creation? Or is it a result of sin? Is it therefore possible that corruption, disease, and human death may well be a consequence of sin, but plant and animal death as part of the cycle of nature are not? One might then reasonably argue that Romans 8:20-21 refers to decay and corruption as distinct from death. Now, I don't imagine that I've solved all the questions that arise here. In particular, two things spring at once to my mind. The first is, where does animal pain fit into all of this? For it would be said, if predation is part of the cycle of nature, how can that be a good thing when, as we are increasingly aware, it is frequently attended by the most horrific suffering on the part of the victims? Was there, for instance, a difference between animal behavior outside the Garden of Eden as compared with the idyllic situation inside? If so, what was the cause? That brings me to the second thing, the role of the serpent in the entry of sin into the world. What was this creature whose insinuations, according to Genesis, triggered such a seismic catastrophe from which the world has been reeling ever since? The serpent appears unannounced on the page of Genesis, simply described as one of the creatures that God had made. But that is already telling us something, and simultaneously raising many questions. For this serpent is a creature, so God is ultimately responsible for its existence, yet it is clearly opposed to God. In other words, Genesis is saying that there was already an alien in the earth, a being that apparently had the capacity to disobey God, had done so, and was now encouraging the first humans to follow suit. Now, some people will dismiss all of this as primitive mythology. I don't. However intriguing all of this may be, we cannot, of course, divert here into further discussion of it. I simply wish to make the point that according to Scripture, evil in the universe appears to antedate the sin of Adam and Eve. C.S. Lewis puts it this way: "It seems to me, therefore, a reasonable supposition that some mighty created power had already been at work for ill on the material universe, or the solar system, or at least the planet Earth, before ever man came on the scene, and that when man fell, someone had indeed tempted him. If there is such a power, as I myself believe, it may well have corrupted the animal creation before man appeared." One thing at least is clear from Genesis: that dark power had corrupted at least part of the animal creation. Could it be that this is the direction in which we must look in order to begin to comprehend the origin of the pain and suffering that seems to permeate the animal kingdom? The question of human origins, are we made in the image of God or thrown up on the sea of the possible random permutations of matter without any ultimate significance? That question is of major importance for our concept of our human identity. It's therefore not surprising that ferocious efforts are being made to minimize the difference between humans and animals on the one hand, and the difference between humans and machines on the other. Such efforts are driven, at least in part, by the secular conviction that naturalism must in the end triumph over theism by its reductionist arguments in removing the last vestige of God from his creation. Human beings must, in the end, according to naturalism, be proved to be nothing but physics and chemistry. That brings us to the question of theistic evolution and the so-called God of the gaps. According to Genesis 1, the sequence of creation acts came to an end. On the seventh day, God rested. The work of creation was done. That would seem to imply that what went on during the creation sequence is no longer happening, an implication that has consequences for one of the major assumptions of science, that is the uniformity of nature, the idea that the present holds the key to the past, at least to within a minute fraction of a second from the beginning. Putting it another way, Genesis seems to be saying that nature has not been absolutely uniform. Genesis is not denying the important fact that nature is largely uniform. Indeed, a further implication of the Sabbath is that after his creation activity, God continues to sustain the universe. The universe constantly depends on his providential care, as a result of which we can rely on the regularities of nature that God himself built in at the beginning. A famous example of this is contained in a statement that Jesus made in Matthew chapter 5. I quote, "For he, that is God, makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust." Christianity, therefore, is not to be equated with deism, which holds that God lit the fuse, triggering the origin of the universe, and then retired from the scene and had no further involvement. On the other hand, the very concept of the Sabbath implies that God's will in maintaining the universe in existence does not exhaust what the Bible means by creation. The New Testament confirms these two aspects of God's relationship to the universe as both creator and sustainer. Paul ascribes these two functions to Jesus himself as he writes to the Colossians. For by him all things were created, and in him all things hold together. Similarly, the letter to the Hebrews says of Christ, through whom also he, that is God, created the world, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. According to Genesis, then, creation involved not just one, but a sequence of several discrete creation acts after which God rested. This surely implies that those acts involved processes that are not going on at the moment. Of course, such supernatural creation acts from above, so to speak, would appear to science from below as discontinuities or singularities, a suggestion that is highly unpalatable to scientists in general and biologists in particular. For example, physicist Paul Davies writes from a non-theistic perspective, I quote, "Ascribing the origin of life to a divine miracle not only is anathema to scientists, but also is theologically suspicious. The term God of the gaps was coined to deride the notion that God can be invoked as an explanation whenever scientists have gaps in their understanding. The trouble with involving God in this way is that as science advances, the gaps close and God gets progressively squeezed out of the story of nature. Theologians long ago accepted that they would forever be fighting a rearguard battle if they tried to challenge science on its own ground. Using the formation of life to prove the existence of God is a tactic that risks instant demolition should someone succeed in making life in a test tube. And the idea that God acts and fits and starts moving atoms around on odd occasions in competition with natural forces is a decidedly uninspiring image of the grand architect. Many scientists who believe in God similarly think that the idea of God interfering, or less pejoratively intervening at intervals, is a kind of semi-deism and is unworthy of God. Such scientists hold that nature possesses, I quote, functional integrity. According to God-given laws, this refers to the potential built into the capabilities of matter at their beginning, without the need for further discrete intervention. Surely, they say, a theistic evolution of this kind is more worthy of God than millions of different supernatural acts of creation to produce the vast array of species, even though there's no suggestion in Genesis or by me that there were such millions of separate creation acts. After all, the number of occurrences of the phrase "and God said" in Genesis 1 is very small. Former National Institutes of Health Director Francis Collins described his understanding of theistic evolution as follows, I quote, "I found this elegant evidence of the relatedness of all living things an occasion of awe, and came to see this as the master plan of the same Almighty God who caused the universe to come into being and set its physical parameters just precisely right to allow the creation of stars, planets, heavy elements, and life itself. Without knowing its name at the time, I settled comfortably into a synthesis generally referred to as theistic evolution, a position I find enormously satisfying to this day." Collins goes on to flesh out his position. I quote, "God, who is not limited in space and time, created the universe and established natural laws that govern it. Seeking to populate this otherwise sterile universe with living creatures, God chose the elegant mechanism of evolution to create microbes, plants, and animals of all sorts. Most remarkably, God intentionally chose the same mechanism to give rise to special creatures who would have intelligence, a knowledge of right and wrong, free will, and a desire to appreciate Him." However, Collins goes on to explain that there came a point in history where God specially conferred His image on a creature that had emerged from the evolutionary process. This was the beginning of the human race made in the image of God. The main points of this version of theistic evolution would appear to be as follows. Firstly, God causes the universe to come into being. Secondly, God sets the laws of physics and the fine-tuned initial conditions. Thirdly, God sustains the universe in being. Fourthly, the universe and life subsequently emerge without any more special, discrete, supernatural input from God, except possibly that at a particular point in history, God specially conferred his image on a hominid that had already emerged from the gradual evolutionary process. Collins takes this view. There are other versions of theistic evolution. For instance, one variant denies the fifth point, claiming that the fourth point includes the emergence of human beings. Biochemist Michael Behe accepts the first, second, and third points, but not the fourth point. He believes that evolution has occurred in the Darwinian sense, but that it has been supervised. He argues that the scientific picture is that natural selection and random mutation do something, but that their reach is relatively limited. That is, there is an edge or limit to evolution's variational capacity that can only be transcended if mutations are introduced that are non-random. In other words, Behe is suggesting that an input of intelligence is needed and that a designer got involved in these mutations. Thus, in this view, God moved atoms on many occasions in the evolutionary process. My response to theistic evolution is firstly that it forces me to think very hard. As a scientist, I am sensitive to the danger of falling into a God of the gaps mentality and running the risk of intellectual laziness. I do not find the main evidence for God's activity in the current gaps in the scientific picture, actually. I believe God is the God of the whole show. Indeed, for me as a mathematician, the very mathematical intelligibility of the universe and the subtlety and power of the mathematics developed to describe it constitute major evidence for the existence of a creator. Theistic evolution now asks why we should introduce a special supernatural act of creation at the point of the origin of life. Would it not be more consistent, says theistic evolution, to think that the origin and development of life proceeded in exactly the same way as the processes before the origin of life? Surely it would be a pity, having come so far, now to introduce a God of the gaps simply because there is as yet no plausible explanation for the origin of life. The last point's rather ironic because theistic evolutionists open themselves up to the very same charge over the origin of the universe and, in many cases, the origin of human life. Of course, the issue is not whether or not God could have done it in a particular way. Clearly, as a basic principle, God being God can do it any way he chooses. And he has, so far as we can see, chosen to do at least part of it by using what we often call natural processes, like the formation of galaxies, suns, and planets that appear still to be going on at the moment. The question is, though, did God do all of it in that way? Is there any reason to think that there were several discrete acts of creation, for example, origin of life, origin of humans, that occurred within the history of the universe, that are fundamentally different from events that normally happen in God's world governed by his laws? And why does it matter anyway? Is this not a case of Christians getting involved in an irrelevant sideshow? I don't think so, especially in light of the current insistence on the part of many atheists that there's nothing special about human beings, since they have been produced by precisely the same blind and unguided processes as any other species. The status of human beings is no small issue. And that brings me to talk about singularities, miracles, and the supernatural. All of these considerations weigh with me at this juncture. Firstly, it is common knowledge that most physicists seem to be able to live with the view that the origin of space-time is a singularity. Certainly, theistic evolutionists seem comfortable with the idea that God was responsible for that singularity as creator. He was the first cause. The universe did not come to be through natural processes. I believe the reason something exists rather than nothing is because God willed it to be so. Secondly, as we pointed out earlier, many theistic evolutionists hold that the origin of human life involved some kind of supernatural discontinuity. Thirdly, and most importantly, it is part of the historic Christian faith that there have been other singularities in more recent history, preeminently the incarnation and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. These events, of course, have a physical dimension, but they clearly do not fall within the range of the explanatory power of the laws of nature. On the contrary, these events were caused, as the New Testament indicates, by the direct input of divine power from outside the whole system. That being the case, I find it strange that some Christians seem to find a priori difficulty in the claim that there have been some additional singularities in the past, like the origin of life and the origin of human beings. Surely, in my view, if one grants, say, at least three major singularities, creation, the incarnation, and the resurrection, there can be no in-principle objection to believing in a relatively few additional singularities, especially if there is both scientific and biblical evidence to support them. That brings us back to the matter of gaps. Some gaps are gaps of ignorance and are eventually closed by increased scientific knowledge. I call them the bad gaps that figure in the expression God of the gaps. But there are other gaps, gaps that are revealed by advancing science. I call those the good gaps. The fact that the information on a printed page is not within the explanatory power of physics and chemistry is not a gap of ignorance. It is a gap that has to do with the nature of writing, and it is a gap that we know how to fill with the input of an intelligence which is not an intelligence of the gaps, but an intelligence demanded by the nature of the gap, because the only explanation that makes sense for writing is that it ultimately has an intelligent source. So that the question is this: does science give any evidence for any more singularities? My answer is that just as science and the Bible converge and complement each other on the origin of the universe, they do so also on the origin of life, among other things. First, we must clear away a major misunderstanding. Contrary to the widespread public impression, neo-Darwinian evolution cannot account for the origin of life. Richard Dawkins was wrong when he said in The Blind Watchmaker that natural selection explained not only the variation in life, but also the existence of life. His error has nothing to do with belief in God, but is a simple matter of logic. Darwinian evolution presupposes the existence of a mutating replicator in order to get it going in the first place. In other words, it presupposes the existence of life. Hence, Darwinian evolution, by definition, cannot be an explanation for the existence of the very thing without which it itself cannot get started. In his more recent book, The Greatest Show on Earth, Dawkins now admits that natural selection cannot explain the existence of life. But there's another consideration, and that is the matter of information. You see, there's an immense gulf between the non-living and the living that is a matter of kind, not simply of degree. It is like the gulf between the raw materials, paper and ink, and the finished product, paper with writing on it, that I just mentioned. Raw materials do not self-organize into linguistic structures. Such structures are not emergent phenomena in the sense that they do not appear without intelligent input. Indeed, evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne is recently reported as saying, "Knowing how life began will be forever beyond our reach. It is biology's cosmic horizon." You see, unguided processes do not generate the language-type information that is found in RNA and DNA. Indeed, even if unguided natural processes were to produce a machine, which assumption is of course essential to atheistic belief, that machine would still not create any novel information. Leonard Brewing, in his classic work on information theory, writes this: "A machine does not create any new information, but it performs a very valuable transformation of known information." What I personally find odd about the theistic evolutionary view of the origin of life is that it seems to fly in the face of these scientific considerations. Indeed, the claim is that such natural, unguided processes not only created information, but also created a creature that could create information, namely a human being. Scientific considerations, however, from information theory point in the exact opposite direction, straight towards a special, intelligent, creative act as the only credible solution to the question of the origin of life's biological information. This contrasts sharply with a statement made by a British theistic evolutionary biologist, Dennis Alexander. He says this: "Imagine going into an artist's studio and then telling the artist you've chosen the wrong type of paints. They're really hopeless." I think we would all agree that that would be insulting. But to confidently proclaim that the precious materials which God has brought into being in the dying moments of stars do not have the potentiality to bring about life seems to me equally insulting. I think this argument is fatally flawed, since the analogy does not correspond to the application. No one is suggesting that the Creator's materials are the wrong type or hopeless. What is being suggested is that the Creator's good materials cannot bring life into existence without the additional direct intelligent input of the Creator himself. This is no more an insult to the Creator than it would be an insult to the artist to suggest that his paints are incapable of producing a masterpiece without his direct input. It is rather the ludicrous suggestion that the paints could do it on their own without him that would be an insult to the painter. Furthermore, it is no more intellectual laziness to reject the idea that life is a product of the latent potential of matter and energy working according to the laws of nature than it is intellectually lazy to abandon the search for perpetual motion or to attribute a magnificent painting to the creative genius of Da Vinci rather than to the latent physical and chemical capacities of paint and canvas. That brings me now to the matter of evolution of the gaps. You see, the charge of believing in a God of the gaps has got to be taken seriously, and I do. It is, after all, possible for a theist to be intellectually lazy and to say, in effect, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. But many of those who accuse Christians of God of the gaps type thinking are themselves guilty of the very same thing in connection with evolution. Because evolution is also a notorious gap filler. It's not hard to create a speculative just so story and say evolution did it. Indeed, a scientist of naturalist convictions has to say that natural processes were solely responsible for the existence of life and all of its various forms, since there is no other admissible alternative within the naturalistic worldview. Nobel laureate physicist Robert Laughlin, whose research is on the properties of matter that make life possible, issued the following warning to scientists about the dangers of this kind of thinking. I quote, "Much of present-day biological knowledge is ideological. A key symptom of ideological thinking," he writes, "is the explanation that it has no implications and cannot be tested. I call such logical dead ends anti-theories because they have exactly the opposite effect of real theories. They stop thinking rather than stimulate it. Evolution by natural selection, for instance, which Darwin conceived as a great theory, has lately come to function as an anti-theory, called upon to cover up embarrassing experimental shortcomings and legitimize findings that are at best questionable and at worst not even wrong. Your protein defies the laws of mass action. Oh, evolution did it. Your complicated mess of chemical reactions turns into a chicken. Evolution. The human brain works on logical principles no computer can emulate. Evolution is the cause. I suspect that belief in an evolution of the gaps is actually probably more widespread than belief in a God of the gaps, since concentration on the latter allows the former to thrive almost undetected. I want to reiterate what I've said at the beginning, that we've been speaking about issues over which Christians disagree, and that the danger is that by concentrating attention on those disagreements, we lose a sense of proportion. It is, after all, worth reminding ourselves once more that the New Testament nowhere mentions the age of the earth or the days of Genesis, but it does have a great deal to say about creation. And surely the reason is apparent. It is the fact of creation, rather than its timing, that is the determining issue in shaping the great narrative of history in which meaning can be found. Finally, I remind you that heaven will host some of the greatest thinkers and the most courageous believers of their day who lived and died believing that the earth didn't move, or that it was young, or that it was old. These differing opinions should be a motivation for speaking in a gracious manner to all those with whom we may happen to disagree. Thank you so very much for journeying with me for the past 40 minutes, and I hope that what I've presented enables you to see that the biblical teaching about creation, far from detracting from genuine scientific work, actually enriches our understanding of origins and their significance for us as human beings. And I really do hope that it will help you to make up your own mind on these very important matters.